dijitalleştiriyoruz. Alıcı, satıcı ve finans kuruluşlarını bir araya getirerek finansmana erişimini hızlandırıyoruz. Tüm bunları 120'den fazla anlaşmalı alıcı firma ve 1,2 milyar doları aşan finansman hacmiyle gerçekleştiriyoruz. 50 binden fazla ticari işletme 10 yıllık uzmanlıkla büyüyor. Tüm bunlara ek 20'den fazla entegre finansal kuruluşla aylık 50 milyon dolar işlem hacmine sahip bir yapıdan söz ediyoruz.
Şimdi ise yapay zeka destekli risk analiziye tanışma zamanı. Figoscore, Ticaret Sicili Gazetesi, Findex raporları ve çok daha fazlasını sizin için analiz eder. Potansiyel riskleri tespit eder, ticari güven endeksinizi oluşturur. 2 milyona yakın şirketi takip eden Figoscore ile bilinçli kararlar alın. Figo Para ile nakit akışınızı yönetin, Figoscore ile risklerinizi analiz edin.
Evet, kriz kahini olarak da bilinen konuşmacımız Trump 2.0 devrinde yeni küresel düzen ya da düzensizlik temasıyla bizlerle birlikte olacak. Profesör Nuriye Rubini, Stern Business School LLC CEO. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Rubini.
Hello, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Thanks for inviting me to this event. I used to come to Turkey regularly, almost every year before COVID, and then COVID came, and this is my very first visit since then. So it's great to come back to this great country, economy. The Chinese usually say, may we live in interesting times, but in Chinese actually that means a curse, meaning the times could be slightly less interesting, both locally, nationally, and globally, and still be quite interesting. What I say is that we live in times of unusual, unprecedented, unexpected uncertainty, foreuse, times of what I've also called in my book hyper-uncertainty. My book was published 2 years ago, Mega Threats. I think that it's important to consider that there's a change now in the global order, both the economic, monetary, and financial one, the trade and investment one, the technological one, and the political and geopolitical one. And to understand where the world is going is to understand what this change is occurring. We're moving away from a period of relative stability to the period of time and a regime of instability, of uncertainty, of volatility, if not outright chaos. We used to live in a world where there was multilateralism. Now we live in a world of unilateralism. We have moved from a world that was unipolar after the collapse of the Soviet Union with one global hegemon, the United States, to a bipolar world with US and China, to now a world that is multipolar. There is US, there is China, there is Europe, there is India, there is still Russia, a weakened power, but one that is militarily aggressive, and other powers in the global south. Some people say actually it's not a multipolar world, it's a no-polar world. It's a world of essentially not G10 or G20, but G0. We've moved from global rules to global deals. We've moved from who is right to who has might. And unfortunately today, might makes you right in this world where the law of the jungle rules more like the rule of law. We've moved from collective global security to spheres of influence, from cooperation and competition among great powers like US and China, to confrontation and containment. Trade war that could become a full economic war, and a Cold War that could become colder, and eventually even a hot war on the issue of Taiwan. We've moved from benevolent alliances to now a period of time where there are empires with vassals, from territorial restraint to territorial grab, from provision of global public goods by major powers to a resource grab, from ideas of internationalism to return to realism and real politics. We moved away from liberal democracy and democratic capitalism to illiberal democracy and various forms of autocracy. And of course, these movements away from liberal democracy to illiberal democracy, autocracy, is in part driven by income and wealth inequality that is rising and economic insecurity that pushes people towards economic and political populism. We moved away from a time where private sector growth was the main one and key one to now one of government intervention in key sectors of the economy, from an ideology of neoliberalism to one of economic populism, from market-oriented economic regimes to state capitalism, from hyper-globalization to various forms of protectionism, deglobalization, decoupling, de-risking, or globalization, from trade and financial integration to trade and financial fragmentation, from relative freedom in the movement of labor across countries to a crackdown on various forms of migration, from economic efficiency to now concerns about ensuring economic security and resilience, from just-in-time global supply chains based on China to just-in-case China +1, from offshoring of economic activity to a efficient one to reshoring, friendshoring, and nearshoring. From a period of time where taxes were low and there was a supply-side economics to now high transfers and subsidies and tax credits to key and favorite sectors of the economy. From free competition to the support of national champions, from laissez-faire free markets to industrial policies, from governments that were hands-on to now governments that are hands-off to governments that are now hands-on, from democracy and competition to plutocracy, kleptocracy, and oligarchies. From a period of time where there was a dominance of the US, dollar supremacy and dominance, and exorbitant privilege, to the risk right now and talk about de-dollarization. After the global financial crisis, we had secular stagnation, a period of time where growth was low and inflation was below target. But then after COVID, we had a period of stagflation, where inflation was rising, going towards double digits, and growth was falling because of negative aggregate supply shocks. The good news is at least in this world of volatility, chaos, and turmoil, because of the technology of the future, starting with AI, machine learning, and so on, we may be moving from secular stagnation to secular stagflation to now a secular boom, where economic growth may be increasing significantly, driven by AI and a variety of technologies of the future. For a long time, we had an AI winter, quantum winter, fusion energy winter, but now we're going to an AI boom. It's going to lead to AGI, artificial general intelligence, or ASI, artificial superintelligence. The economic consequences are going to be also important. Not only there may be an increase in economic growth because of the technology of the future, but we have gone to a period of time where inflation was low after the global financial crisis because we were in a secular stagnation. Demand was low as people were deleveraging, and inflation was low, to a period of time where there was high inflation during the COVID crisis, where there were negative aggregate supply shocks, and therefore inflation was rising. But in the world of a secular boom, there will be deflation, but good deflation, not driven by lack of aggregate demand like the Great Depression, but instead driven by a significant increase in the aggregate supply of goods and services. So it's a positive deflation, tech-driven by these positive supply shocks. Today, I don't have time to talk in detail about these new technologies of the future, but they're not just artificial intelligence or machine learning or AGI. It's also robotic and automation, including massive emergence of humanoid robots. Biomedical research and synthetic biology is going to make us live healthier and for longer. Quantum computing and its merger with AI, space exploration and exploitation, AI-led semi-autonomous weapon system for a new era of warfare and related defense tech. Unfortunately, in the world of geopolitical depression, we need the weapon systems. Everybody's going to spend more on defense, but defense is going to become high-tech rather than low-tech. We also have agtech and the revolution in production of agricultural products. We'll have fusion energy that more than renewable will help to resolve climate change. We have the green tech and the mobility revolution, a new frontier of geoengineering. They're going to help us to deal with global climate change. There's fintech. And a lot of fintech actually is not based on DLT or blockchain, but by the use of big data, AI, 5G, and machine learning to make investment decisions, insurance, capital market ones, payment system, and a variety of other financial activities. There's a new material science leading to new materials and new types of manufacturing. There's going to be cybersecurity and new forms of cryptography. Now, if you think about these technologies of the future, and I listed 12 of them, US is and will remain number one in most of them, with China being only a modest number two. China is ahead only in green tech and the mobility revolution, like electric vehicles. So US is number one, China is number two, while Europe and the rest of the world are very far behind US and China by order of magnitude, if you look at the data. Now, the consequences of this secular boom are that US economic growth that today is only 2% potential growth. By the end of this decade, it could be as high as 4%, meaning by 2030. And by 2040, could be as high as 6%, meaning growth accelerates, becomes exponential. This is important because in the past, whenever you had tech innovations, they were logarithmic. You have a growth spurt, growth accelerates and then flattens out and maybe falls again, like after the first internet revolution. If you have growth that is exponential, every decade the growth accelerates as opposed to decelerating. This is also important because people say the US may be ahead of China, but China is second, but investing in technology of the future, and soon enough, China could be ahead of the United States. That can be true in a world of logarithmic innovation, but when you have exponential growth, then if you are a first mover, you have an advantage. Because if you are the first mover, the second one can never catch up with you, because you are the first one adopting technology that have exponential growth. Therefore, I'm skeptical of the idea that China is going to catch up with the United States and become number one in the technology of the future. US is going to be the country that's going to have that first mover advantage and is going to benefit the most from exponential growth. China is going to be behind, second, maybe not a distant second, but a second. So while today a lot of people are talking because of the Trump tariffs that are reckless, that this is the end of American exceptionalism, that US may end up into a recession, that American exceptionalism is going to be over, that money is going to flow out of the US to Europe and other parts of the world, I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical because while, of course, tariffs in the short run have a negative growth effect, over the medium term, tech trumps tariffs. Tech trumps tariffs. Why do I say so? If US potential growth is going to go from 2 to 4% by 2030, that's a 200 basis points increase in potential growth, 2%. Suppose you have the tariff announced on April 2nd. How much will US growth over the medium term fall? In the worst case scenario, maybe 50 basis points. So you get 200 basis points from technology up, you get 50 basis points down because of tariff and protectionism and trade wars. That's a ratio of 4 to 1, 200 divided by 50. So tech trumps tariffs. I will also argue that tech trumps Trump too. Tech trumps Trump too. Why do I say that? Last December, when Trump came to power, I wrote a piece discussing what are the policies of Trump, whether it will lead to higher economic growth or lower economic growth, to higher inflation or lower inflation. And I argue that, of course, many of his policies can reduce growth and can increase inflation. Protectionism, trade wars, migration restrictions, unfunded budget deficits, fooling around with the rule of law domestically and externally, trying to reduce the independence of the Fed, trying to have a disorderly weakening of the dollar. All these things are stagflationary, lower growth and higher inflation. However, I argue that the bad policy will be constrained and guardrailed by 4 factors. Factor number one is market discipline. As I argued then, if the stock market goes down, if bond yields go higher, if credit spreads widen, you'll have to back down because the market is going to punish you. Trump can control his own party, can control Congress, can control the Supreme Court, can even control social media, like he's already in charge of X via Elon Musk. But he cannot control the bond vigilantes and the stock market vigilantes. There was a former advisor of Bill Clinton, Jim Carville, they once made 2 points that were important. Point number one, he said, it's the economy is stupid. If you want to stay in power, the economy has to do well. If the economy doesn't do well, eventually you lose power. Second thing he said was, he said, in my next life, I don't want to be born as the Pope or the President of the United States, but I want to be reborn as the bond vigilantes, because I go around and beat up people that are against me or doing stupid policies. And what led Trump to back down and start negotiations with Europe, Japan, and 70 other countries, when the stock market crashed 20%, when the bond yields started to rise, and when high yield credit spreads went through the roof. Market discipline works. You cannot go against the markets in the United States, in Turkey, and other parts of the world. If you follow policies that are stupid, eventually the market punishes you, and you need to do policy correction. Because if you don't do policy correction, things are going to get worse, not just for the markets, but also for the economy. Second point, and Gardner I spoke about, Fed independence. The Fed is independent. Tariff policy is going to lead to higher inflation. And Powell has said, I'm not going to cut rates. Trump may be threatening to fire him, but that's going to backfire. Because if you fire him, inflation expectations get de-anchored, and bond is going to be higher, not lower. So in that game of chicken between Trump and Powell, Powell is stronger, and Powell is not backing down. And therefore, the Fed independence implies that if the policy of the US lead to higher inflation, the Fed is not going to cut rates, maybe even raising rates. And that's going to slow down the economy. Constraint number three, good economic advisors. Some of the economic advisors of Trump are a disaster, protectionists, nationalists like Peter Navarro and others, but others like Scott Bessent, Secretary of the Treasury, or Steve Miran, head of the Council of Economic Advisors, are more sensible. Four constraint. Trump has a very narrow majority in the House, only a few votes, and already many representatives are saying, I'm going to restrict the trade negotiating authority of Trump if he's going to go for tariffs and protection, because that hurts my people and my own constituency. So market discipline, Fed independence, good advisors, and thin majority in Congress, those are the four guardrails that led Trump to blink with everybody, but one country, of course, China. Because with China, the tit-for-tat escalation is continuing for the time being. So what's going to happen? We started negotiation with China, with everybody but China. However, as I pointed out, even in a scenario in which you don't reach a deal with China, tech trumps tariffs, not only over the medium term, but also in the short run. One of the reasons why the US has been growing closer to 3% for the last 2 years has been there have been massive tailwinds coming from AI-driven capital spending, investment by the corporate sector. Not just the Mach 7, not just the hyperscalers, not just the firms in the NASDAQ, but also banks or other corporates. In the US, either you have an AI strategy and you do investment in AI, even if you're a big bank like JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citi, or otherwise you're worried they're going to be left behind and obsolete. So that AI-driven CapEx is a major driver of economic growth, both over the medium term, but also in the short run. That's why most likely the US is going to avoid a recession this year and over the medium term. Tech trumps tariffs. Why do I say that tech trumps Trump too? I say so because the dynamism of the US private sector is so strong in terms of innovation that in some sense it doesn't matter who's in power in Washington. Today is Trump, it could have been Kamala Harris, could have been somebody else. You could have literally Mickey Mouse running the presidency in the White House, it doesn't matter. US-American exception is going to remain because the dynamics of the private sector implies that US growth is going to go from 2 to 4% by the end of the decade. Of course, there are dangers. The danger is the beginning of a new tech, industrial, military complex in the United States and the consequences politically and geopolitically of that. There is also, for now, an escalation of the trade war between US and China. US has gone to 145%, China 125%. And that implies, of course, the risk of a US in a global recession. Will there be de-escalation or not? The way I put it is that today there is a three-way game of chicken between Trump, Powell, and Xi Jinping. And the question is, which one among these three is going to blink first? And there is also a Trump put, a Powell put, and a Xi Jinping put. And the strike price for the Trump put was much higher than the one for the Powell put or the Xi Jinping put. That's why when the stock market fell 20%, bond yield rose, and you had an increase in credit spread, Trump blinked compared to Powell and Xi Jinping and decided to start negotiation with Europe, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and the rest of the world. So Trump has already blinked compared to most trading partners, the exception being China. And of course, that situation is going to continue. Now, who's going to blink between Trump and Xi Jinping? Think of it this way. China and Xi Jinping do not face elections, while Trump faces election next year. China can do macroeconomic stimulus, fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus, letting the currency weaken, manipulate the stock market with intervening with their own banks. It can also do structural reform to reduce savings and increase consumption. It can also punish the US, not through tariffs, but through the exports, restriction of exports of rare earth metals or refined industrial metals like copper. 70% of all refined industrial and green metals are being refined in China. It can punish Apple, Tesla, and hundreds of billions of dollars of foreign direct investment made by US firms in China. And of course, it could even end up using the nuclear option of dumping treasuries. It holds almost $1 trillion of treasury and pushing bond yields much higher. So in the short run, actually, Xi Jinping has more leverage than Trump. However, if you think of it from a medium-term point of view, China will have a greater economic pain because the US exports to the United States are about 2% of GDP, while US exports to China are only less than 0.5% of US GDP. So if we're going to have tariff of this level and no trade with the US and China, Chinese growth could just fall by 2% just through the trade link, nothing else alone. Of course, if you think about the bigger picture of this tariff war, is Trump tariff shock leads to stagflation in the United States, lower growth and higher inflation. It also leads to lower growth and lower inflation in the rest of the world. Lower growth because of the trade links, lower inflation because all the countries that run a trade surplus to the United States will have now excess capacity, Europe, Japan, China, South Korea, Taiwan, and so on, and will have to dump in global market this excess capacity. So that causes lower inflation in the rest of the world, higher inflation in the United States. The trade shock of the tariffs also implies that while growth in the US is lower, the impact on growth in the rest of the world, among the countries that run a trade surplus with the United States, is bigger. The shock to their growth is bigger than the shock to growth in the US. Why that's the case? It's obvious. Since they're running a trade surplus relative to the United States, any tariff that reduces their export to the US is a demand shock that is bigger as a share of their GDP than the shock to the United States. Because as a share of GDP, their exports and net exports to GDP are much bigger number than US exports to the rest of the world. So in this trade war, the impact on growth is more negative in the rest of the world than it is in the United States. So that's the situation we're facing right now. Now, Many people are asking right now, are we going to have a US and global recession? And will the stock market continue to crater and collapse, or is it going to be recovering? And what's going to happen to the dollar? What's going to happen to bond yields? What's going to happen to credit spreads? I think there are three scenarios you have to think about and assess the probability of these three scenarios in assessing what's going to happen to the US, the global economy, and the markets. Scenario number one is the more optimistic one. You have a trade negotiation now between US and other trading partners, and eventually you'll also have a negotiation not just with Europe, Japan, and friends and allies, but also with China. And suppose that this trade negotiation implies that the deal is one in which tariffs after this negotiation are about half as much as they were announced on April 2nd. So Europe was 20%, you cut it down to 10. Japan was 24, you cut it to 10, 12, and so on and so on. And with China also, you reach a grand bargain of some sort. If that's the case, because we're not going to go back to zero tariffs, I think that 10 is the new normal. So at least 10% is going to be there, but 10% is something we can live with. It's not great, but it's not terrible. Meaning, if the tariff on Europe will be 10% eventually, the euro can go up and down 10% in a matter of months compared to that. So you can live with 10% tariff. Same story for Turkey, that doesn't export very much to the United States. So the scenario number one, this is the ideal one, is you do a deal with everybody, including China. You have a grand bargain. In this scenario, you avoid the US and global recession, and markets now are down, they're going to go up again, because we have avoided the disaster. Second scenario is the other extreme. You start negotiation with all trade partners, but they fail for some reason. And you start negotiation with China and they fail, or you don't even start negotiation with China and you remain at these levels of 100% plus tariffs. In that case, tariffs are going to remain at the level announced on April 2nd, and then you have a hard landing of the US and the global economy. You have a US, European, Chinese, emerging market recession. And markets fall even more than they fell right now. So you're going to end up in more than a correction. You're going to end up in a bear market. You're going to have a stock market crash. And then because of inflation and tit-for-tat trade war, you could end up with high bond yields. And with default rate rising, with high credit spreads. So you end up in a total economic, monetary, and financial chaos. However, these two extreme scenarios, one of a happy ending and one of a total disaster, neither one of them is likely. I think the more likely scenario is the middle one, in which you do a deal negotiating down the tariffs of April 2nd to half as much with Europe, with Canada, with Mexico, with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, India, and lots of other friends, allies, and frenemies in the global south. But you don't reach a deal with China. And you don't reach a deal with China either because you don't start negotiation with China, or if you start negotiation with China, they fail. And why do I worry that even if you start negotiations with China, you're going to fail? Because what Trump and US is asking from China is something that Xi Jinping cannot accept. So the sets of policy concessions that are agreeable to Trump and the set is agreeable to Xi Jinping may be a null set, an empty set, rather than a set that is having some positive elements. Why? US is complaining about China having tariffs, non-tariffary barriers, restricting FDI, government procurement, state capitalism, stealing intellectual property rights, having subsidized forever exports, the cost of labor, the cost of capital, the cost of land, the cost of energy, the cost of even water, being a state capitalist country, and so on and so on, and on top of that, killing dozens of thousands of Americans through export of fentanyl. The kind of things that Trump wants from China are not acceptable to China, and therefore, even if negotiations occur, there could be a collision course. If that's the result, then we get into a near global recession. I say near global recession because you're not going to have the severe recession of scenario number 2, because you have a trade deal with everybody but China. But if US and China have autarky level of tariffs, US growth is sharply down, Chinese growth is sharply down, and then everybody else suffers. Because when US and China sneeze, the rest of the world, of course, catches the cold. So it's not going to be a total disaster like a full trade war with everybody, but the scenario where you don't have a deal with China while you have it with everybody else is still very, very painful for everybody. You'll have growth slowing down, market correcting even further compared to that. And I would say the most likely scenario is number 3, one of successful trade negotiation with everybody, but not successful negotiations with China. So that's the risk we're facing right now. I'll make the following other observation. Of course, people are worried about investing in the US. And in recent weeks, not only the stock market has gone down, but the dollar has gone down as bond yields have gone higher. And people say that's the end of American exceptionalism, the end of the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. The US dollar is going to collapse as a global reserve currency. And of course, if you weaponize the dollar for national security and foreign policy purposes, with trade and financial and technological sanction, people are going to try to diversify away from the dollar. However, in my view, the news of the demise or death of the dollar are vastly exaggerated. You know, the American writer Mark Twain once says, the news of my death are vastly exaggerated, because some people suggested he was dead while he was not. So to paraphrase him, the news of the demise or death of the dollar are vastly exaggerated. Why do I say that? There is political chaos in the United States. The Trump policies are leading to a huge amount of uncertainty. It's making unhappy not only rivals like China, but also friends and allies from Europe to those in Asia, all over the world. However, if it's true that tech trumps tariffs, that tech trumps Trump too, because it's going to be boxed in, US is going to go from 2% growth to 4% growth, and that 4% growth is going to be driven by a US capital spending and investment boom that's going to be like never in US history. And that's going to lead to massive inflows of foreign direct investment into the United States. And therefore, you have to remain over-invested in US assets, because the strongest global growth is going to be in the United States, even if you may not like the politics domestic of the United States. So we're moving to a world that's going to be divided between US and China spheres of influence. And there's going to be a decoupling in trade, in economic, in financial, in technology, and in monetary affairs, and also in terms of global reserve currency. And countries are going to have to decide increasingly whether they are with the US and the West, or whether with China. The traditional friends and allies of the US will have no option but staying with the United States, because it's the dominant economic, trade, financial, technological, and geopolitical and military power for the West. Countries like Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and a few others may become formal friends and allies, and the global South will increasingly have to decide, I'm with the US or I'm in China. If there is a grand bargain, you don't have to make the decision. If there is a grand bargain between the US and China, you de-risk things that are important and critical and strategic, like technology, but you don't decouple in trade on all sorts of other things. But if instead there is a failure of that grand bargain and there is full decoupling, not only in the critical high-tech industries of the future, but across the board, then people have to choose whether with the US and with China. But that's a very, very ugly world. But my concern right now is that the potential for a grand bargain with the US and China is shrinking, and instead of having de-risking in stuff that is important, we potentially risk having an unmanaged and destructive full decoupling between US and China. That decoupling is not going to be just on trade, it'll be a full economic war. And if there is a full economic war, there is a risk that the Cold War between US and China becomes colder, and the Cold War becomes eventually a hot war on the issue of Taiwan. Because what's restraining today Xi Jinping from invading Taiwan or having a naval blockade? The main constraint is not the threat of military action, but the US could punish China by cutting off all trade with China, all financial links, all technological links. But if the US is already imposing 140% tariffs on China, and therefore trade and export of China to the US are going to go to zero, then at that point, why should Xi Jinping restrain himself? If there is no trade, if the carrots and sticks of a threat of deglobalization are gone, because already deglobalized, you might as well go take over Taiwan. And if you take over Taiwan and there's the beginning of a war between the US and China, it's not going to be a conventional war. It could become unconventional, and something much more ugly is happening. So I would say we live in very interesting, but also very dangerous times. And the risk is that the world of relative peace, progress, and prosperity that we had since 1945 might be over. A world of geopolitical depression, where there is economic wars, where there's trade wars, and economic and trade war can lead also to geopolitical wars, not just cold ones, but eventually hot ones. So everybody has to work together to avoid the more extreme scenario. If we do so, it will be a more divided world, more deglobalized world, but one in which we can manage things. If instead we go for complete decoupling, it will be a very, very scary period of instability, chaos, and volatility. Thank you very much for your attention.
Mr. Rubini, thank you very much for your impressive remarks. Thank you. Thank you. Evet, Sayın Rubini'ye teşekkür ediyoruz. 2 günlük maratonumuzun ilk periyodunu geride bıraktık. Yani birinci günün ilk yarısını, şimdi günün ikinci yarısında US 2025'in 4. paneli değişen konseptler ışığında savunma teknolojilerinin geleceği oturumuyla devam ediyoruz. Önce kısa filmimizi izleyelim.
Teknolojiyi tasarlama vizyonumuz, yerli ve milli teknoloji hedefimiz, inovasyon tutkumuz ve yatırımlarımızla geleceğe hazırız. Savunma sanayi teknolojilerinde döner kanatlı insansız hava araçları ve kamikaze İHA'larla dünyada sesimizi duyuruyoruz. Akıllı şehirlerden güvenli dokümanlara, biyometrik sistemlerden kimlik yönetimine yenilikçi çözümler geliştiriyoruz.